Thanks very much. If everybody's ready, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to start by welcoming everybody to this workshop about a pedestrian bridge over the Assabet River. I need to first begin by thanking our hosts, Nick Eddy and Novaya, for hosting us in this wonderful space right next to the Assabet River. My name is Gary Kleiman. I am a former member of the West Concord Task Force, the West Concord Advisory Committee, the Planning Board, and was a co-chair of the Envision Concord long-range plan for the town of Concord. And so I'm just going to start by giving a very quick overview of some of the history of what got us to this point by way of introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to Grace and James, who are going to give you more background on where we go from here and take us through the rest of the agenda in terms of the project objectives, a little bit more of the existing site information in context, as well as a few of the pedestrian bridge options. And then there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. So this is the part I agreed to give, just a few slides on history. How did we get to this point? This is not necessarily a new idea, although it may seem new to many of you who are just coming to this, but as far back as 2001, when this site was redeveloped, some forward-thinking members of the town staff and the community had the wisdom to ensure that public access was retained along the banks of the Assabet River, as well as a conservation easement. Even back then, there was thinking that perhaps some connectivity between this site as it got developed and the West Concord Village would be useful. So they retained that conservation easement and public access, and they also were able to negotiate $10,000 in funding for transportation demand management. I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about where those funds were used, but a few years later, in 2005, Concord, which periodically does a comprehensive long-range planning process, revisited this goal of thinking about transportation and circulation goals between the village center and this site. And they actually expressed a specific goal around looking into funding for a feasibility study. Again, in thinking about perhaps at that time satellite parking for the village center over here, and pedestrian access for the Baker Avenue development and the commercial areas of West Concord. A couple years later, in 2007, when we undertook the Village Centers study, again, people were assessing the potential for walkway connectivity from this site to West Concord Center, enabling people using this site to explore, create and enhance connections with not only the village district, but also a greenway along the Assabet River. So all along, this recurring theme of, well, can we enhance connectivity and can we enhance access to the river in West Concord was in the back of people's mind, but it really was in 2010 with the West Concord Village Master Plan that it became not so much in the back of their mind, but a specific and explicit goal to construct a pedestrian bridge over the Assabet River. Now in 2017, just a year ago, you remember I was talking about some funding, the $10,000 for transportation demand management. Well, we finally put that money to use and did a feasibility study. This feasibility study looked at a 1,000-foot stretch of the Assabet River between Baker Avenue and the West Concord Village, identified 4 potential crossing locations, looked at a range of different bridge options, a trestle bridge, a truss bridge, a beam bridge, and basically explored in this feasibility study some of the trade-offs between the number of footings that would be required for each type and the costs, ranging from between $2 million, $3.5 million. So a lot of considerations there, but we had the feasibility study done. In 2018, building on that work, the town did a detailed river survey of this same 1,000-foot stretch of the river to basically understand exactly where footings would be required, with detailed topographic surveys of the depths at different locations along the widths, the areas of wetlands, and where access would be more challenging and easier. And then, of course, also last year, I'm sure everybody is aware that the Long Range Plan Committee published Envision Concord Bridge to 2030. And in the open space section of that plan, we again included some specific goals around ensuring that the village centers were connected to open spaces. And along with a specific recommendation to pursue funding and achieving a pedestrian access between Baker Avenue and the village center, we also looked at, again, connectivity along village riverways, including the Assabet River here in West Concord and Mill Brook in Concord Center, the Mill Dam area. So I think that's the end of the history. And I'll just end on this slide talking about, where do we go from here? The next steps, obviously, now that we have a feasibility study, what would be a final design? Develop the construction drawings, permitting. We have some estimates for the cost of that. The plan is to tap the community preservation funds, the CPC, to try and take us to that next step. And then, of course, construction would require a significant fundraising effort. Congestion mitigation, air quality funds through the Federal Highway Department would be one possible area to explore for funding. There are other grants. Mass Works has community development grants that we could consider. Obviously, town meeting is, I guess, I would say a last resort option, because another of the goals of the Envision Concord plan is to really keep an eye on our fiscal sustainability here in town, and we've already had large increases in the tax burden for the schools, so that is an option. But I think, to the extent that we can leverage state and federal grants, that would be a better way to try and fund this. But we're always open to private gifts if somebody happens to have an extra couple of million or knows a company or corporate sponsor that wants to bring this vision to fruition. That would be wonderful. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Grace and James to take it from here and talk a little bit more about what our next steps might look like.
Great, thank you. Oh, I don't need this. Okay, let's put this over here. They've hooked me up with a. I'm wondering if you can hear me though. Is it? Am I projecting all right? Right.
Yeah.
We have lab mics. Okay.
Can you hear me? Is that okay? A little louder? Okay. Well, I'll raise.
You can also come closer. So I will just introduce ourselves. I'm Grace Law. This is James Dahlman. We're both partners and co-founders and principals of Law Dahlman Architects. Our practice began in 1999. Just to tell you a little bit about us, we came to the Boston area in 2013, where we opened our Boston branch of our office, which is now the headquarters of our operation for architecture and urban design and infrastructure. We have, part of the reason that we came to the Boston area, we actually did our graduate work and my undergraduate work at Harvard University, where we actually met. And since that time period in 2013, when I arrived, it was partially because I was invited to be the director of the architecture programs at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, where James and I have both been teaching since. And one of the things that drew us especially to this incredibly interesting project is partly because as an architecture firm, we are very invested in public space and infrastructure projects. It's kind of an area that we've been drawn to for many years and has been the kind of, let's say, backbone or central mission to our work involved in community-related projects that have very strong ideas about civic space. And we believe that that's really actually very important in this country, where much of civic infrastructural work is actually not handled by many designers and architects. It's actually mostly in the hands of engineers, and so we like to partner very closely with engineers, but hopefully have a very design-led process which can engage the community in issues of design that affect the community. I'll just also mention that, again, many of our, I would say again, the backbone of our practice involves civic and institutional clients as well as nonprofit organizations. Again, we are a very mission-based practice. We've done several bridge projects. Again, it's been something that we've been very interested in. And in fact, this project here, which is the Marsupial Bridge located across the Milwaukee River in Wisconsin, was funded in large part by CMAQ funds. So we have been very engaged in the process of helping communities actually also find that funding. We know that these are expensive projects. But I think there are resources, and we've been very successful at getting, at assisting with the grant writing process as well, because a lot of the material, hopefully, that we will share with you today will work into a document that could actually become the working documents that we put forward for any grant funding that you might pursue. And again, I think the major goal of many of our projects has been to seek a kind of sense of, a very powerful symbolic sense of civic space and belonging as part of our mission of our practice.
So it's kind of self-evident, but the project objectives include this connection, this very important potential connection between this, the Baker Avenue Business Park, to the commuter rail station and to the West Concord Village Business District, to extend the access to the landscape and recreation provided by, for instance, the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail that's now been put in place, to create potentially a contemplative destination, a place to get away, a place to get into nature, make it safe and accessible. That's very important. Bridges can be seen as kind of off the beaten track, and so they should be made well illuminated and feel very safe and open. Sustainable strategies should be involved to the greatest extent possible, but in particular, when we make better connections for pedestrians, we're improving quality of life, but also creating more sensible commuter possibilities. And to coordinate with the Envision Concord Bridge to 2030 plan to make it integral to the community's vision for the future. Some Concord context, we noticed that the website features a bridge, I think it's the North Bridge, the old North Bridge. There are demographic shifts going on in the community that we want to respond to in terms of change in age of the population, but also a kind of fit between development and workforce and access to the surrounding amenities on the site, and in particular to this sense of connectivity to the West Concord Village Center. In response to the Envision Concord 2030 plan, this notion of balancing change with tradition, responding to a thriving community that is changing, and in particular, again, evolving transportation needs and connectivity. Concord bridges are part of, I think, the ethos and history of the community. There's a kind of consistent presence of bridges throughout the community, crossing small waterways and roadways, but also part of the history of Concord itself. That's the North Bridge in various manifestations. It was rebuilt 4 or 5 times.
It was fun for us to survey and catalog the kinds of bridges in your community, to get to know the full range and actually the varied types, from stone arch bridges to steel bridges. It's been an interesting...
So railway bridges from the 1870s, concrete structures, and timber as well. So there's every type of bridge, but I think we all know that this part of the community is not well connected in this immediate vicinity. So some existing site information that we think is very critical to this process that's based on the feasibility studies and the Bruce Freeman Trail. So I need to raise my voice a little bit. Yeah, it's hard for me, so I'm sorry. I'll try. Is that better? Okay. The Bruce Freeman Trail is a very interesting connector through West Concord, providing access to recreation and natural landscapes, and obviously connects directly to the commuter rail and to the center of town. The area of interest, of course, is here between this building and West Concord Town Center. The survey work that was done was very important to kind of unleash the sense of the constraints, the parameters, and the opportunities for where best to place crossings across the river. And we looked at various cross-sections and placements of potential bridges along that cross-section of the Assabet. It's obviously a very beautiful destination that changes throughout the year, but it's also full of wildlife, clearly. And this is a view across one of the potential crossing points for a bridge. So we looked very specifically at these site constraints from the survey, which are the kind of starting point for designing any bridge on this site.
Yeah. So what we did was we took, this kind of site survey is often a little bit difficult to read, so I hope that this might clarify some of the existing conditions, and we've built up in layers a kind of graphic mapping, so just to get a sense of where north is this way on this particular, we're going to actually shift at a moment the orientation of the drawing. But of course there's the river itself. Then there's bordering vegetation along each of these, which is outlined here. These are the defined wetland areas. And of course the tree canopy. 100-foot inner riparian
the riverfront
floodway.
area for habitat, riparian habitat.
I want to show you. This is at the mean annual high water mark. And this, we're going to revisit this drawing a couple of times because it's quite important. This area defines what we're referring to as the floodway. And the floodway, you know, of course there's the river itself, but the floodway is the area outside of the river where you will have intense water flow.
Something, I'll just point out that the commuter rail is kind of a nozzle. It's a point of constriction of the flow of the river. So at that point, the floodway becomes very narrow, but also very intense. And as it stretches out and can spread out over the site, it broadens. And that becomes a very critical issue because though a floodplain is much broader than the floodway itself, the floodway is where the most intense hydraulic pressure is of a flood event. So that's the area that we need to try to keep the most clear of any obstructions.
And this is a kind of plan diagram of a 10-year flood, and then of a 100-year flood.
So Sorry. So just zooming in and looking at the village itself and the surrounding areas. This was from the master plan. You can see the location of the 4 possible bridge sites, one next to the MBTA, 2 more further up, and one at the very neck of the Assabet River where it meets the Neshoba Brook. So those were, kind of 4 obvious possible locations spread out across the site. But in terms of access from the village, there's some key points. So along the commuter rail to the south edge, straight across the main new set of developments and the drive that passes through that site, and then further north, just before the Neshoba Brook, where the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail meets the Neshoba Brook. From this side of the site, there are potential connections you could imagine all along this edge, but there's one that's particularly prominent, which is here, which we'll describe to you a little more in some photographs, but there's a very clear shot through the forest, essentially from this point in space all the way through to the Assabet River, which is a clearance that was made for some sewer lines, and I believe it was cleared for that purpose when they put the sewer line in, but it is a very clear path. Of course, the Bruce Freeman Trail connections to the north and south. And if we just focus on this side, so again, from this vantage point, so if we were standing on that deck looking out towards the Assabet River, you can imagine yourself moving in a pretty straight line past the parking lot, out into the forest, and through this clearing, this line of clearing in the forest that leads all the way to the river. So that's one potential route from this vantage point. If we turn around and go to the other side, this is the connection point that might be right at the Neshoba Brook, just where the Bruce Freeman Trail crosses the Neshoba Brook and leads through that conservation area. And if we were to imagine those 2 connections meeting in a kind of shortest possible route, it might look something like this, where you'd pass through the conservation area along the river edge, cross at a relatively short crossing, and then move over or in either direction, but kind of making the shortest distance between 2 points. Another possible route is based on the southern edge. So if we imagine moving across the edge of the rail line, the commuter rail line, and then from this vantage point, moving across the edge of the parking lot towards the south. Those are the 2 views one would get. They're kind of pretty straight shot, which would end up in a bridge across the southern edge of the site near the commuter rail line. The advantage of this being it's at that neck of the floodway where it's narrowest, and could lead to potential other connections. So a connection in this location could be more of a bike trail connection, whereas people might walk their bikes through a path that leads through the conservation area. Here, there could in fact be a dedicated bike trail. That's a view of the clearing at the south end of the Assabet as it kind of runs underneath the rail bridge. And this is a view from the rail bridge back into the Assabet River. So it's a pretty interesting viewpoint for the river because it's a broad clearing.
We tried a number of bridge concepts, thinking through it. There are, of course, many different kinds of structural types that one could use and think about. And again, you have a kind of your own catalog of these in the West Concord region. The feasibility study identified these 3 types as being very, as the possible types for you. The 3rd type, the trestle bridge section, which is here, we kind of eliminated with the idea that because it would require so many foundation points into the waterway, which is not good for the floodway issues and wouldn't make sense. However, these 2 strategies in which there's either a beam connection or a truss spanning seem to be optimal structural strategies that we could begin to think about. If you take the cross-section in the other direction, the different kinds of structural strategies that one might choose result in different kind of cross-sections in the short orientation. So a truss would create a little bit more of a volumetric expression of the structure, but it's actually low beneath the deck. In others, you would get much more depth, and you might need to raise the bridge a little higher. So you can see that the choice of the structural strategy really affects both the aesthetics and the quality of the bridge, its height. And so what we did was we tried to look, given that we were preparing for this workshop with you, at 3 different strategies, which attempt to look at different structural strategies so that we could kind of elicit from you your thoughts about it and pros and cons of each, and also test different sites. So again, these are the 2 that we thought were the most optimal in terms of thinking about how we might approach a bridge project. And then when we look at the sites, on the right-hand side, you can see an actual plan of the river at this location. And these sections correspond to different points of the river. Now, I think what's important here, what we'd like to point out, is that when you look it's kind of hard to see here, but when you look at section A, if you go back 1 slide, James, at section A, this is a cross-section taken very, very close to the point. Maybe you could just point out where it is. And one of the challenges of that location is that it produces, next slide please, it produces the largest floodway span at that location. So what we thought about was perhaps we should focus our study on the other 2 locations of possible locations for the bridge crossing.
So in other words, we're kind of ruling out crossing the Assabet close to the Neshoba Brook because it involves such a broad floodway to traverse that it's going to create more problems with regulations, but also structural spans. It becomes the longest bridge in a way.
So again, and this is a kind of 3-dimensional view of the site. And what we did is we focused then, as James is saying, on these 2 areas because of the floodway. Next slide.
So this is the commuter rail line. That's that neck in the floodway. And you can see how it gets tight here and spreads out and gets even broader as it goes further north.
And so these became the kind of 2 locations that we started to study for the bridge schemes that we would like to share with you today and get your feedback on.
Just to remind us that the floods are pretty intense and quite high. The other thing that we should just point out quickly is that this red line is a very critical line. It's the line above which we have to keep the primary span structural components of the project. So the underside of the bridge has to
always
stay
be above
that red line to keep the floodway clear.
What is that red line called?
It's just the underside of structure minimum. So it's actually higher than the 100-year flood. It's a calculation that is based on the floodplain level, but then some clearance for debris. But it's approximately a foot higher than the 100-year flood, 1.5 feet or so.
Yeah, so the blue line is the 100-year flood. It's very hard to see, and the printouts in the back when you get close, yeah. The blue line is the 100-year, and this green, lime green line is the 10-year.
So you'll notice when we show these, we'll have cross sections that show the structure. So when Grace pointed out a truss bridge puts most of the structure above the walking surface, and that structure can actually be physically lower in space than a bridge that has most of the structure underneath the walking surface, which that brings the walking surface up higher.
Right. We'll use the designs as a way to describe that.
So we're going to now talk, without that long introduction, we're going to just talk about 3 possible schemes using those 2 sites And the first two schemes are on the northern site, so kind of midway.
Now, these are nicknames for the bridges, just so that we can identify them. This is what we've been, this is not the name of the bridge, but just for us to kind of create as much difference between the schemes as possible to share with you.
And we really want to emphasize, we want feedback based on all sorts of different observations you might have about the location, about the configuration, about the quality, etc. So, Assabet Landing is based on the idea that the bridge itself could be more of a kind of landscape feature, a kind of gathering space in addition to a crossing. So it wouldn't be a purely linear condition, but a little bit more generous in terms of being a place to stop, a place to spend some time, to fish, to gather, whatnot. And it's more related to the surrounding landscape, and also means that most of the structure is underneath the walking surface. So we looked at these two primary connection points on either side of the river. And one obvious position for a bridge is straight up this line in space. Another is to turn it to make it a little bit shorter. And eventually we came up with a strategy that would kink the bridge to both connect to these 2 points in space, these 2 axis orientations, and also to simultaneously create the shortest span.
So the plan of the project then, as we were developing it, it was interesting because that little kink and trying to find exactly the sweet spot between managing all of the different points of destination allows for a path of movement to be clear through, but also creates these additional spaces, deck spaces, if you will, that you might be able to use to gather, to have eat lunch out there, to fish off those decks. So it was just a way of thinking. We called this the landing. Obviously, it's a bridge, but it really does encourage other kinds of public space as part of the programmatic driver for this particular scenario.
So there's that key cross-section that shows the clearances that have to be maintained. And this bridge accomplishes that by putting most of the structure underneath the walking surface so that nothing goes above rail height. So everything is relatively open as one's passing over the...
Very expansive view, because you would have nothing overhead.
And it takes that kind of shape on the site. Do I have to?
Just hit the button again.
Yeah, there. So this is a really quick fly through without any materials. But you can see the obvious path that's ramped. So everything would be ADA accessible, as every bridge should be. That's a fundamental parameter for all these projects, is anything would be fully accessible. But this kind of configuration would provide these overlooks that are off the path. And feel very open at the same time.
Yeah, this is,
There's
I should
no
just say, these are, the bridges
here.
that we're going to show you, these 3D models have absolutely no material capacity, partly because we haven't actually, we'll show you some renderings of the things, but the 3D models are studies of shape and form, so they are absolutely intentionally devoid of material palette. Yeah, I know.
I hate to say it, that's how it works. It's the reason you have to look at what's really popular. So that Concord Bridge, which is a replica of the original bridge 7 times over, is on every website.
Right.
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 You have to understand why that happened.
Yeah.
It's the materiality, it's the shape, it's the symmetry.
Right. So we're going to show you.
So we have.
Showing us high-tech AI.
No, we're actually not. That wasn't the intention of that. I apologize. Because really what we wanted to do is just show you form.
If you give us a chance to go through all the schemes, there's more information. So, yeah, thank you. That's good feedback. We want feedback on observation. So, this is a view looking at the bridge from the landing as one approaches. So, again, it's subtly sloping up, but it does have to reach a higher level to get that clearance underneath the underside of the structure for that clearance to be maintained. From the other side, there could be a small amphitheater and steps that lead up adjacent to the ramp, so it would have both ramp and steps, so you could have two ways of getting up. And from above, it would have path and gathering space.
And the proposal for materials, the suggestion for materials in this case was a combination of the structural concrete that would provide the underside. And as you saw in our Marsupial Bridge design, we've worked very extensively with wood. It is one of the areas of expertise in our practice. And so the proposal would be that the larger areas in which you're intended to sit and touch and gather, have lunch, would be of a wood timber. That would be our proposal. We used ironwood in the Marsupial Bridge, which was a very effective material both for maintenance and durability, but also because it was just had warmth, a warm palate.
Just as you brought it up too, I think what's important is that this is the beginning of a process, not the end of a process, and it would involve engineering that would be very detailed and would help determine the final outcome of material choices and span types. So none of this would be in a vacuum, and it would have to meet certain requirements of span. So we can't just, we have to work within some constraints of materials and technology that's available today. So that's the first scheme. The second scheme, we're calling it Assabet River Trellis.
It draws on the kind of history of lattice arcades it's actually more of a kind of picturesque landscape device that has been used in the past. This is actually from India in the late 18th century. But in addition, next slide, it actually looks at some of the New England covered bridges that you find throughout this area, in which the structure here, again, this is a truss structure, and oftentimes these bridges were covered to not only protect the bridges from weathering, but also to give a kind of sense of enclosure. So we tried this scheme as well because we thought that the lattice work could be actually quite beautiful and quite volumetric, and give you an opportunity even to bring vegetation to the project.
And again, just as a reminder, if truss structure can be above the roadway or the footpath, then we can get more clearance underneath the structure and drop it down closer to that minimum height above the floodway. But of course, it creates a sense of enclosure, which is different than being completely open. So again, with these two access points on either side of the river, possible straight line, but then we looked at, there is actually a subtly narrow neck in the floodway at this location, and we ended up slightly off that, which also connects to some of the existing paths, and is a more, let's say, a taller structure that you pass through. So it would have more presence in the landscape. It's more of an object. It's more of a building. But it would be a little bit lower to the existing site because most of the structure is above.
Now in this model view, again, this is just to show you the kind of shaping. It does not actually have what we haven't been able to study yet, because it's quite intensive, is like the amount of spacing between the lattice to make it very porous and very transparent. These are just quick tests to see kind of what you could get and how you could start to manipulate the lattice to open it up to certain kinds of views and to make places of opening to slide through and outside of it. So again, this is just the beginnings of this kind of study to give you a sense of this strategy when the structure is above you.
I do have a comment. I think there's a real difference between that bridge and the old-fashioned bridge that have a sense of history that you show.
Sure.
You should really explore that, and I would argue, to be correct, you should do a preference study. Which building, the traditional bridges or that bridge, the kind of wild-shaped one, would people like to see? Most people aren't trained as architects. 0.001% of the population should need to do the study. Because I would argue the old bridges felt like Concord, and I can connect to. What you showed me feels a little off-putting and weird. And I could be wrong, but for you to do this project, you need to do that preference study. That's what people do now. You need to understand the human, biological, emotional experience before you can say you're improving the public realm. And you haven't done that.
We're here to have conversation after the presentation too, because I want everyone to have a chance to talk. So the idea is that this puts most of the structure above and has a relatively lightweight structure that could conceivably be built off-site and lifted into place, which would create the least amount of impact on the site because it could be largely prefabricated, could tie into some of the interesting history of wood fabrication that's here in West Concord. We literally can't build buildings like we did in 1750. They just can't.
You can't do that, but you can understand why those symmetries, you can use modern neuroscience to understand why those symmetries make that architecture perennial. The problem with this is asymmetry is harder for the brain to do and harder for the brain to remember.
Yes, please. There are in all of them a little bit of a crown. So in order to get as much site elevation as possible, we thought that this could be arced slightly in the cross section. Right. Yes,
Keep
please.
going.
Uh-huh.
And this is your best guess structurally at this point, even though we don't know, we can't decide on materials yet, but you're thinking around the scale of the site.
This is a very first pass. It's one option. It could be bigger or smaller. I wouldn't make it much smaller than this. This is relatively small. But remember, the bigger you make it, the more impact it has on the site. So I think there's a balance between comfort and a feeling of it feeling spacious and not too constricted, and feeling open, but not so big that it dominates the site too much. Yeah. Of course, yeah.
I'm going to actually...
Absolutely. We anticipated that, frankly, we anticipated that this conversation would be about extreme examples, and we've got one more to show you, that are based on the site, based on different material possibilities, different spatial possibilities. They are in no way an answer. None of these is the answer to the site, because it will go through engineering, it'll go through lots of issues. But we want your feedback, all of you, to be able to voice feedback in various ways. So, feel free to ask questions as we go. And,
I think it might be helpful if you repeat the question. It's a little hard to hear
yeah,
from one side
thank you.
to the other.
The question was, what size did we imagine this particular scheme being? And it's kind of open-ended still. So, the third scheme, which relates to that site immediately adjacent to the commuter rail. Did you want to say something about this?
These images just share with you some of the things that we've been thinking about, because that site at the commuter rail location, maybe you could just advance, has an opportunity to gather different strands of movement and points of access across the site. So here again is the commuter rail, and as James mentioned, this is actually the shortest zone of the floodway. So it has essentially the tightest kind of spanning issue going on here. But one of the things that was intriguing to us about this site, though it's in parallel to the commuter rail, is the opportunity to connect to more locations. For example, it could veer off towards this business complex here, and or be part of a potentially new bike trail system that would be, again, many communities we've been involved in several of these where there have been rails to trails and or adjacent trails as saddlebags to rails. So interesting opportunities for other possible connections in this location.
So in a way, this is less of a destination, but more of a piece of infrastructure that connects broader areas in the region together more directly, and especially with bikes.
So here we were very sensitive to the fact that the bridge would actually be running alongside the commuter rail, and so one of the ideas was to create a kind of lattice structure along this edge to kind of veil the view and sound and exposure to the actual commuter rail on this edge. So that's why this bridge is actually quite asymmetrical in its quality, and it forks to offer those different paths of movement.
And there would be kind of a slow lane and a fast lane, so the bikers could keep going through without intimidating people walking, strolling, in wheelchairs and whatnot. And this is a view, section view looking back south towards the commuter rail, and you can see there's that red line again that we have to stay above. But this, what would be kind of interesting is this bridge could tuck in next to the commuter rail and still allow the commuter rail to look out over the landscape.
Here's the commuter rail, and again, we just wanted to show you, again, this is just the volumetric study of how it's connecting.
So clearly one's first impulse would not be to put a bridge immediately adjacent to the rail line, but there are some real advantages to the span. If I could just finish for a second. The span that's available here is much shorter for the main span. So it can be very tight, and the supports can be close together, and the span is short. On the other hand, because of the terrain, this one has to stretch a little further. So though it doesn't have to be as deep a structure, it has to go a little longer.
And we were thinking in this case, the lattice work that might be on one edge might allow the project to have a kind of interesting lenticular quality where you're looking at, when you're looking through it, you actually see a clear view. When you're looking at the side of it, it actually becomes opaque. So it was just an interesting thought about how we would continue to develop that as both a structural strategy as well as a visual one.
I think
Images?
It's really important that you study what makes existing bridges in Concord that are on the postcards successful. And one element you will find is they have really human-scaled routes. So people aren't scared going over them.
Yes.
This is true of the Old North Bridge. This is true of the little bridge going over Neshoba. It's
Yeah.
quaint. That's what people come to Concord to see. Quaintness and
Right.
cuteness. And what you've shown is very scary. There's no sense of where a person is or how big is the person is. And it looks like it's filmed from a drone. That's not what Concord is. It's about the person.
So-
Something. But even here in this design, you put stuff in. Everything looks like it's in a highway.
Right, so this bridge,
Yes.
Sense of material.
So I want to kind of, because we're going to give people time to look at everything, bring this back, allow people to ask other questions. You know, this is day one, hour one.
Right.
This is not it, and so the feedback is really great, and I think was the whole purpose. And so this is like barely your toe in the water. But I do have a question. Yes.
I just want to voice, I really appreciate the three options that you've shown, and they really raise a lot of interesting issues, like the issue of community gathering versus transportation, like just being able to get speedy in and out of the village.
Right.
And I personally would be really excited to see a novel and interesting, architecturally interesting, modern expression for our village. I think that would be, it would be a destination. And the one thing I like about it being right on the train is it would be a landmark that you would see out the train window that you would want to go back and visit. And I think it'd be wonderful to do something with color.
yeah, I mean, one of the things that we had imagined and we talked about as we were trying to work through this in the office was the question of how, for example, seasonally, things might really affect it. I mean, there might be lanterns hung from this thing at different times of year if you had a lattice structure or if you had something that was a kind of canopy condition above. And so we actually thought one of the goals would be to take your feedback and work through a single scheme in more detail so that we can actually flush out all those potential ideas of how the community would author this potential bridge. This is an interesting, I didn't spend a lot of time, but I just mentioned to you that this is an existing 1925 viaduct in Milwaukee, which was originally a bascule bridge. And our insertion here was a pedestrian bridge that was slung through the very center of this viaduct because it was overstructured in the middle. And the key here was to provide really warm materials and really, really inviting lighting, because I think that transformed people's perception of what you could do underneath the existing viaduct bridge. And in terms of gathering, this exceeded our expectation of what the public could begin to the events that could take place here. At each of the bridge landings, that's actually an image at one side of the, as you launch on one side of the river. And it has now become, the Milwaukee Film Festival's outdoor summer space. So we've been really surprised at how the community has really been able to use some of these spaces. And I think that's why in all of our examples, we were hoping that there would be some space outside of just the line of movement that you could do things with.
Oh, I got a microphone. Hi, how are you? So I think all these aesthetic things are wonderful. It's great that you're looking into them. I'm here for the practicality of the bridge. I know a number of other people are as well. We definitely have trained commuters. I ride my bike to work. I hate going the only way we can go to get here. That bridge is very narrow, very dangerous.
Yep.
So there's a couple considerations. One, by all means, however it looks great, let's at least try to focus on the function a little. And a big important aspect of this is we live in New England, which means it snows. And I'm going to want to use this bridge, and hopefully people will in the future as well, in the winter. So we have to adapt to whatever equipment's going to be run over it to remove the snow. Some of the slats and materials, things like that, get damaged very easily. We've done things in my town with bridges where they have bolts sticking up. You can't clear the snow on them. We make those mistakes sometimes. So I'm just hoping you'll consider those things in the design as far as the maintenance goes for snow removal and all that kind of thing. But otherwise, I love that we're working on this. It's a great project.
Could I ask a question of you?
Please.
Is there a location on the site that makes the most sense for you?
For me personally, the one nearest the train bridge makes perfect sense because people get off the train, that's where they want to go. As far as the interference of the train with the experience, it's very infrequent, most of the people that are going to be using it probably were on the train, so.
I'm wondering how you're working with the Bruce Freeman Trail, because I don't, is this bridge that's totally different from the Bruce Freeman Trail, or are you coordinating with them?
Well, yeah.
Because going from the junction on the new trail that's opened up, there's a beautiful bridge. I think that's over the Assabet. Behind the garage. It's a very lovely bridge. And
With
Behind
the
the
trusses.
bakery?
With the trusses to the south.
No, not.
Oh.
Oh, behind the car wash.
That's not. Yeah, that's not part of the Bruce Freeman Trail. That's a separate bridge that connects the parking lot to the Neshoba.
the Bruce Freeman Trail that has just opened up.
Yeah.
You cross where all those lights are on Main Street and 99 Commonwealth Avenue, and you go back in there, and it's a very lovely bridge. And I think that's the
You know that bridge on the Bruce?
So what I,
It's to the south, right?
so what I
Yeah,
can
that's
tell
what I
you
thought.
is,
Wasn't it?
That through the planning department and permits that have been issued by the Board of Appeals and the Planning Board, the Concord Park Assisted Living is going to be doing an addition off the side of the building. And as part of their permit, currently the path, it's a public path that comes to behind Concord Park Assisted Living. They, as part of their project, will be extending that path
from where the Assabet River and the Neshoba Brook meet, extending that path upward to connect directly with the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail at that point. So, depending on where, this is a very preliminary discussion. Yes, I see your hand. Thank you. This is a very preliminary discussion about possible locations, possible designs, and wherever this happens. Currently they're going to be doing an addition off the end, and that path right there, which is shown on there, actually isn't there yet. It'll be actually constructed and be a little bit more formal and connect to the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. So wherever the bridge hits, there will be at least some type of pedestrian path that connects to the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail.
Yeah, I believe, just to clarify, I think you're talking about the bridge down here on the Bruce Freeman Trail. It was a replacement of a former rail bridge that used to be there, and it's a bowstring truss.
And they're doing another one over Route 2. And so part of me thinks it's for narrative coherence. Have you looked at that?
Yep.
That bridge, and do a version of that bridge where you are?
Which they haven't completely designed.
No, we haven't.
I got that bridge over Route 2. I have the papers for that.
So I'm going
I can send that to you online.
Sure. No. We've been looking at.
Narrative coherence in the whole neighborhood.
Yep.
I have another question regarding functionality. Okay. I have another question. Okay. I have another question regarding functionality. I'm curious about how you took into account Baker Avenue. There are a number of buildings on Baker Avenue from one end to the other. Mm-hmm. How you took into account what is likely to be easy access points for people working in those buildings to try to get to West Concord.
That's a great point, because when we visited the site a few times and looked at the other bridges and looked at the site, we noticed that people were actually using the roadway here as their circulation route, exercise, lunchtime gathering in the road. And I think that it wasn't for us to say exactly how this site should be planned, but that we imagine it would be quite nice in the green spaces to create a little bit more of a path network that would allow people both to get to a potential bridge, but also to traverse the parking zone. But that's kind of it wasn't part of our bailiwick of work, but I think it would be a great idea.
And I'll add on to that only because I'm getting a smile and a nod. The people that own the building, Novaya, has already started. This is sparking, their interest, because you do see the people doing the laps in the parking lot, and whatever happens in the back here, working with and even connecting up behind the Marriott, and then coming across and really making, I'm going to say, a nice circuit path, but gets the commuters who might work over at the aeronautics school or over to Emerson's rehab. So all of those people have been invited to be part of this discussion. So I'm very hopeful that we'll think of Baker Ave and Baker Ave Extension as a I'm not going to say a visitor destination, but for a lot of people, this is where they come half their day every day. So trying to improve that.
Also, frankly, to show you another plan that's not in this package that shows the route around the Baker Ave complex and connecting up to the bike path that leads directly to Concord Center, that creating more of a sense of connectivity between this part of Concord, West Concord and Concord through that path system. Anything we can do to make more of that connection, I think would be good at every point.
Sorry, Gary has a...
And then,
Oh, sorry.
so we'll go with Bruce has the mic first, and then Mr. Kleiman, and then I think they do want people to look at the maps and write your comments and questions, and if you haven't signed in, please do. We're going to kind of make this an active, email participation list. If stuff gets put out there and questions, we're going to try and take any questions that people write down, come up with answers. It might be, we don't know. This is just, the first beginnings, but we'll at least try to get those questions answered for people. Go ahead.
So I like all three of the designs. I think they're really creative, and I wonder if you have any idea um, approximately is if one is much more expensive than another in terms of construction, and also, as this gentleman pointed out, in terms of maintenance, which design would be easiest and cheapest to maintain?
That's,
So I can
those
tell
are
you,
great questions.
people already read through the initial feasibility study that kind of did help narrow things down as far as bridge type and some of the environmental and site constraints for bridge locations. We're talking about somewhere in the range of 2 million to 3.6 million, and that's based on bridge, the type of bridge. And once you get into materials, when this gets to that point, then yes, it's going to be, how does this bridge get maintained? I think you're looking at a significant public-private partnership as far as the maintenance of the bridge. But from the town's perspective, that will be one of those, those top key core issues that need to be talked about.
Right, so I'm curious if one of these designs is different in cost from the others, if you know that.
I'm loath to make too many determinations on that early in the process, but generally, one could say that you have to balance construction cost and long-term cost. And maintenance is an issue. And for instance, sometimes steel can be less expensive because it's lighter and it's easier to transport, and it's a lot of strength per pound, but it's a long-term maintenance issue. So there's balance that one has to, keep in mind. I mean, I think that anything that we can do to reduce impact to the site will have to be factored into the project, because there might be concerns about long-term maintenance and/or access for construction that push in one direction or another that may be separate from issues of maintenance, that balance issues of maintenance.
All right. Just wanted to point out that during the Envision Concord process, when we were doing the long-range plan, one comment went up on our website that was consistently the second most liked comment for a period of, I think, 8 or 10 weeks. And it was about creating access to the West Concord waterways. So finding access points. And I really like your first design, the landing, specifically because in addition to the functional crossing for commuters and people who want access, it also creates access to the waterfront. It has those extra areas off on the sides where you could just sit on and enjoy your lunch, or you could sit and fish, or whatever. So I would urge you to keep access in mind, as well as the functional crossing. And I also like that location better, and think, it's less scary in terms of having that waterfront access that's not right next to a commuter rail train, passing you at 20 miles an hour.
Well, I think she wants everyone to use the microphone because they're recording the questions. But
Oh, sorry. Would it be safe to say that the shorter span would be the less expensive and the one closest to the railroad bridge would be the least environmental impact?
I think that's a pretty good observation. I think that tucking up against the MBTA line is the least impact. It's also the least engagement in a certain way with the more natural areas of the site. But when one engages in the most natural areas of the site, one necessarily intrudes upon them at the same time. So, right, exactly. No, I think you're right. Although I will say that the commuter rail line, because that span is shorter, I think there could be some cost advantages with that as well, because of the shorter clear span required over the floodway. But
so this may be one more question for, okay. Okay, so this may be a question for Elizabeth. In terms of location, I see advantages to having it near the commuter rail for bike commuting, but I also see that for people who work in those buildings and people who want to go to the Concord Hillside offices, having it more, north or west would be advantageous. but my preference would depend on what the plan is for reconstruction of that Route 62 bridge and whether that's on a Mass DOT plan for any time in the near future. Because if they were going to redo the bridge over
This one? Which bridge? Sorry?
The Route 62, yeah, Main Street. If
That's Main Street, yeah. I think it's that one. It has
right.
sidewalks that are maybe 18 inches wide.
Yeah. So if that were going to be redone
Right.
and there was going to be a bike lane added, then I would sort of have a preference for moving a pedestrian bridge further
That's
northwest.
a good point.
So
That's a really
I'm
interesting
not
idea.
aware that it's on any transportation improvement program list yet. I will definitely check. I know that as they're looking at the Route 2 corridor, like the bridge over the Assabet on Route 2 is something that they're going to have to deal with because of its condition. But I have not seen the Route 62 bridge on the list, but I'll take a look.
That's a fascinating idea, though. I think combine, get the best of both worlds. If you could combine a relatively inexpensive addition here with one and put them further apart, that would be of some benefit. Yeah.
Do we have a feel for what the percentage of the population here at 300 Baker and this conclave use the commuter rail?
I do not have that information. No.
I think a lot by what we've seen.
What we've heard.
I think so. There's over about 1,000 employees in this building alone. So I think now, that we're starting to kind of kick this off, that we will be looking to do those types of destination kind of surveys and ask.
If it's a good-sized population, it would seem to push towards the...
So that connection, yeah.
Lots of questions, so.
This is great, actually. This is very helpful.
I like the idea of going across where you can observe the river. It's nice to walk in places like the Old North Bridge where sort of by yourself and you can go across, or you're in a different situation, or Walden Pond where I often walk. I wonder, though, when you're going from one building to the other and you're just sort of crossing the river, if that's going to be a primary focus, or if you find, with all good intentions, it's really just a functionality, as somebody mentioned earlier, from getting one place to the other. I also question if you're going to build another big yellow box to the north where they're going to fill in, yes,
Right there.
if it'd be idyllic as going behind Concord Park, seeing a big 5-story whatever building, then going across the bridge. So I would opt for a more functional position down by the railroad.
So that, for you, that suggests just accept the functionality of
Yes,
this, because
yes.
this won't be as pristine as one might guess?
Yes, it wouldn't be used that much for, you're going into the woods, or you're going into nature. Not to say you wouldn't stop and take advantage of it, as I do when I cross the Neshoba Bridge there at Neshoba Bakery, but that's sort of fleeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful.
I'd like to add on to that, because as someone who only works out here and doesn't live here, I think a lot of times we want to go into West Concord for lunch or something like that, and just the walk around Main Street is bad, and then also it takes a considerable amount of time. So for me, the advantages to this bridge are cutting down that time, so it's a really functional sort of thing. Like, I don't necessarily, I'm one of those walkers that walks around the building all day, or at lunch. So I could see all day. So I could see, use for a nice space like this. But I'm definitely a vote in terms of functionality, and I want to get there in a decent amount of time. While it's still pretty is nice, but function is a big one for me. And I think a lot of people that work in this building, you could open up so much more avenues to West Concord. It would be a quicker lunch break, something like that.
So I came late to the party, but I came late to the presentation, but I'm curious. Did you start with explaining what the underlying goals were for the project, or has that been established? If you did, then I can
We
find
generally did, yes.
that. Okay, and you talked about that?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh,
Great,
okay.
thank you.
Sure.
So I know that they would like to look at the plans, write your comments, write your questions, and this has been better than we hoped for, so thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Yeah, thank you for the feedback.
Walking the trains in Harper's Ferry. Part of the Appalachian Trail goes right across the river, right next to the train bridge. And my son's actually, who I stay here all day.
I really like this. I do. What I like is that instead of having an object within nature, that's how I read the other ones. This one looks at nature.
Is much broader here, so there's a lot more sensitive terrain and flood hydrostatic pressure on a bridge here. This creates a little bit more direct connection here and still gets relatively close to.
Okay, welcome everyone to our workshop. I'm Matt Johnson. I'm chair of our planning board in the town of Concord this year. And this microphone is only for the video's purposes. So you won't hear me through the mic, but you'll hear me anyway. So my job here is just to kick things off before La Dolman takes over and shows you some of the exciting designs and ideas for this new pedestrian walkway. So just to give you a little bit of background, how did we get here to this workshop? And what might be the next steps? So, oh, and yeah, maybe I should review the agenda before we do that. So we'll talk about the project's objectives, the site information. There's been a survey done, so there's nice detailed information about the site, and then the possible different footbridge concepts, and then we will engage you to have some discussion in Q&A about these proposals. So now let's move on to the history behind this. Like a lot of municipal projects, this is not a snap your fingers and it's done type of thing. It's not quite as long so far as the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, which we hope will be completed very, very soon. But it does go all the way back to 2001 and to the redevelopment of this 300 Baker Ave property. At that time, is part of the conditions of the permit that was issued for the redevelopment, the ZBA required public access to in conservation land, as well as $10,000 that could be used to help develop transportation demand solutions. And we'll see that, keep a hold of that money. We didn't actually end up using it for that, but we ended up using it for this much later on. Then in 2005, we had a comprehensive long-range plan that was done. And in that plan, there was an idea to investigate putting satellite parking over here for the commuter rail, along with some pedestrian access to the commercial district. And I believe that the initial idea was to just create kind of a cantilevered extension off the railroad bridge and just sort of walk along there, right? Which would be nice and cheap, but it would also be dangerous and would also require us to work with the MBTA, which is not an easy thing to do as a town when you're going on their right-of-way. So the next step was the Village Center studies. So this was a document that was done for all of the different village centers with proposals for how to improve them over time. So while it wasn't specifically a comprehensive long-range plan, it was very much focused on our village centers, and it was the genesis of a lot of great ideas that have since come to pass. That also included a goal to have a pedestrian walkway from Baker Ave to West Concord Center, and added another dimension to this. So rather than just straight sort of satellite parking or pedestrian access to commerce, it also added connections and pedestrian greenways. So take advantage of the river resource that's there. Then in the 2010 West Concord Village Master Plan, that was kind of anticipating a lot of redevelopment that mostly now has occurred in West Concord Village Center. There was, again, reiterated the idea of having a pedestrian bridge. So lots of studies, lots of desire, but not much action up until this point. So fast forward to 2017, and now things start to move on the ground. So that $10,000 was sitting there all that time, and apparently not in an interest-bearing account either. And so that was used to hire a consultant, and the consultant used that money to prepare a feasibility study. And then in 2018, there was a survey done of a detailed survey that has, I think, informed some of the construction of the models and the plans that you see here today. And then there was yet another long-range plan completed, and in that one there were, first of all, very overarching goals for the entire town to, a core goal to improve connectivity. So it sort of bubbled up to being a very high priority rather than just a desire. And then, the pedestrian footbridge, along with two other projects, really were prioritized as examples of the kinds of projects that could improve connectivity, and the one that was most associated with West Concord Village. So that brings us to what's next. Well, tonight you'll see some of the concepts and that we hope will get people excited about this and move us to the next step, which would be to try to get design construction drawings that you could build from, and permitting so that you could build done. And the estimate is around $220,000 to make that happen. Now that's still not a bridge. That's a nice possibility of really building the bridge. And it's the kind of project that we can try to pursue using community preservation funds, but we'll also need other sources to match. And then to build the bridge itself could cost between $2 and $3.5 million, which seems like a lot of money, but it is what these things cost. And it could be funded in part by grants, by also our own town meeting capital projects, though there are many competing projects at this moment. And then, of course, by contributions from businesses and individuals to get this done. So I think that takes me through the introduction, and now we're able to introduce our architects and see what this thing might look like.
Great. Thank you, Matt. So I think I would just wanted to introduce, I'm Grace Law, principal and co-founder of Law Dahlman, James Dahlman, my partner.
We have other microphones for the recording. It's not,
yes, unfortunately,
it's not amplified, unfortunately. Yeah.
Apologize. Just to introduce ourselves, we've been in practice, this will be our 20th year. We actually originated in Wisconsin. Most of our work spans both buildings and infrastructure and civic and public space. So this was a very exciting opportunity to look at your community and to think about how this piece of infrastructure actually is really about a community and the vitality of West Concord and all of its surrounding area. Also, the beautiful trail system that you have here and the wilderness area that I think it needs to be preserved. So I will just mention that among the recognition that our practice has received, this pertains a bit to Matt's comment about funding. We have been successful recipients of certain kinds of grants that would be very helpful. One in particular, CMAQ grant, which provided about 75% of the funding for the Marsupial Bridge that we designed in Wisconsin. In addition to that, we've also been the recipient of NEA grants, which are specific for projects which are trying to achieve high levels of design, not just utilitarian kinds of built works. So I just mentioned that because I think that's very important in community-based projects, and in the public realm, usually that unfortunately in our country is where there's not a great deal of design investment, though we wish there could be. So I think pulling upon different kinds of grant sources is actually very useful, and we have a lot of experience in that, and we welcome that as a process. Just to mention, we have designed a number of bridges. This happens to be one that is slung under an existing 1925 viaduct across the Milwaukee River. It has also public spaces on either side. We are very drawn to these kinds of infrastructure projects that also provide public space and or are seen as kind of civic components of the community.
So this project is so important for the community, and it's a great opportunity to carry on the Envision 2030 plan and other initiatives in the community. But specifically, this project could serve to help connect the Baker Avenue Business Park, which is this complex, with the Commuter rail station and the West Concord Village Business District. Obvious connection points that really don't feel very connected at the moment. But it could also extend projects like the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail in its character and its connectivity, as well as providing potentially a contemplative destination spot. In addition to just passing through the site, it could be a place to go to, a place to spend time and perhaps do have other activities. It should be safe and accessible. It should engage sustainability strategies, both in terms of the materials, energy use, but also just by making better commuter and pedestrian and bike paths in the community, it becomes a benefit for reduced energy use and connectivity. Again, coordinating with the Envision Concord Bridge to 2030 plan. It also is an opportunity to connect with some of the aura and his history of Concord. Concord's identity is associated with bridges in many ways. It's also a possibility for dealing with some of the demographic shifts in the community to make something very accessible for a changing demographic, for an aging population, for instance, and to tie directly with the West Concord master planning that Matt was referring to. Balance change with tradition to address changing needs of the community. The employer-employee mismatch that happens to be one issue that the community is facing, to get better connections, easier transport, and changing housing needs. There's a lot of different issues that the community is facing, and this project should be part of that whole network of issues. It refers back to and could reference the history of the community as being having these very important sites for bridges, being part of a long history of the community, and being very connected to the waterway system that passes through Concord.
You have a lot of bridge types. almost every type. we enjoyed cataloging and studying some of your existing bridges.
Wood,
Stone arch, wood, steel.
Concrete, wood, again. So back to the central issue of the site itself, the work that's been done with the feasibility and the survey, just wanted to lay out some of that site information for you as context for the project. The Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, some aerial views, the site survey, and some images. So the Bruce Freeman Trail, as you might know, passes through on an old rail line right through the center of West Concord, and is an important connection back to the natural landscape and to recreation for members of the community, and connects right to the center of town at the commuter rail station. And the site for this project is immediately adjacent to that, connecting this site across to the West Concord Village Center. The survey has a lot of information on it, and we try to kind of dissect that, and we'll describe a little bit later the various information that we can draw from the survey to help make decisions about the best placement of bridges that could be the most rational and functional locations.
Your feasibility study, which we have been absorbing, identified a couple of different spots for the bridge. And so what we did preliminarily is take a look very carefully at 3 different cross sections through the river, and to discover certain strategies that we might think about in the site, in the locations for the bridges.
Of course, there's a very beautiful natural setting here along the riverway. This is at the meeting of the Neshoba Brook and the Assabet River. There's obviously quite a bit of wildlife.
You have beaver.
You have
Lots
beavers,
of beaver.
which is unusual. And this is one of the possible crossing locations. So you can see it's a pretty broad span across the Assabet River. It's not a narrow span. Specific site conditions from the survey, the river floodway and floodplain, and some site sections and possible bridge locations that we'll describe to you from the survey.
So this is turned so that north is facing this way. This is the commuter rail.
And we're currently right here, and this direction is straight out that way. So there's important habitat. There's bordering vegetated wetlands. This is very sensitive wetland areas that are frequently inundated with floods. There's tree canopy. There's a 100-foot inner riparian riverfront area, which is sensitive riparian habitat, and a slightly less sensitive extension of that riparian habitat another 100 feet out. There's the bank of the river and the mean annual high water, and a very important condition, the floodway. So if I'll show you here, the floodplain for a 10-year flood inundates most of the site, 100-year, almost all of it. But the floodway itself is very important because it's the area of the river during a flood that is has the greatest energy. So it's where the water's moving the fastest, where it creates the biggest potential possibility for damage to structures built within it, and it should be the least restricted. So we want to keep that area open with any new bridge construction. So to the greatest extent possible, we should be spanning over not the waterway, as you see it today, but over the floodway. And that sets up a set of elevational clearances that are higher than you might imagine across the site. So in order to get a working bridge across that site, you have to be up a little bit higher than the waterway itself.
So what we thought we would do is first share some of the notions about different pathways of movement, how you would traverse, where you might traverse on the sites themselves, but then we'll talk about the bridge schemes that test different areas.
So from the master plan, there were 4 bridge locations identified between this Baker Ave complex and West Concord Village. One was near the MBTA, and 3 others marching further north, and one at the very promontory at the meeting of the Assabet and the Neshoba Brook. But when we look at the connections, the likely connection points to that part of the site, there's an obvious one along the edge of the MBTA. There's one through the center of the new development area, say near the Neshoba Bakery, cutting across the site, and another one potentially to the north, right at the Neshoba Brook. From this side, there's lots of opportunity, but there's a primary one that's essentially from this point in space all the way through the forest to a possible bridge location. But there are others as well that one could branch off in any direction. This is pretty open out here. Of course, then there's the Bruce Freeman Trail that this should tie into and connect back to. But to start with a view from this side of the site across, so looking out from this terrace here, one can see an obvious crossing point. And that could lead through the forest, and there's actually a very clear line of clearance through the trees where they laid a sewer line. So that site's been cleared, and there's a kind of pretty straight shot that leads through the forest to the river. That's one possible connection. From the other side, there's that intersection of the Neshoba Brook and the Bruce Freeman Trail. There isn't currently an entrance here, but there could be one that would lead naturally into an existing path trail system that goes through the conservation area around the Senior Living Center. And if one put these two in connection with one another, if one made the shortest line and space between those two connections, one might find a path and bridge system something like this. Alternatively, one could move towards the south edge of the site in this direction here and along the MBTA.
The commuter rail station is here.
The commuter rail station there. So on the left, that's a commuter rail connection. And here's looking from the roof of this building towards the south, with a crossing close to the commuter rail. The advantage of this site is that it is a shorter span across the floodway.
Why don't we take sections to show that?
And has many opportunities for other connections for bike trails. This is a view of the MBTA, the commuter rail, and a view back to the site from the commuter rail.
So obviously there are so many different ways that one could create a bridge and the different structural strategies that one could use to do that. We have been looking again carefully through your feasibility study and could see that there were essentially 3 suggested methods to best cross at that location. However, we determined that this, together with Elizabeth and others, that this was probably the least desirable because it required so many footing points that would go into the river and into the floodway and into the challenges of a running river. So we focused our study on the upper 2 kinds of strategies. The first one being a beam system, maybe next slide. A beam system in cross-section, as well as a truss, which again, this is the cross-section looking the other way through a bridge, a short section. And you can see that they would have very different consequences spatially in terms of how they would feel and the different aspects for the structure.
So if we took the 3 primary cross-sections through the site.
One thing we'll say about those cross-sections is that what you can see, and these are a little bit more clear on the drawings, very hard to see here, but the actual floodway is quite different in all of those locations. Again, the river looks relatively consistent, but the actual floodway varies quite a bit. So at the top section, the floodway is actually very, very expansive. And so this section A, which is the very top section, you can see that the floodway span is 270 feet. We decided for the purposes of this study at the moment to eliminate that site and focus more of our attention on the other two locations. Again, simply because in this particular, at that location, the floodway is the greatest. That makes sense. So in other words, that very long, expansive floodway actually takes place right here. So we focused our energy to look in two areas that seemed more reasonable in terms of span.
This is the current, say, general water level. That's the floodway. You can see how it broadens a great deal as it passes through the commuter rail bridge. So this is kind of a nozzle. It makes a narrow floodway, but then it gets quite broad as it moves across the site. So you can see it's quite narrow here, and it's a little bit narrower here. And so those are the two natural positions for bridges that create the least impact on the floodway. This is a 10-year flood and a 100-year flood. So you can see that, I mean, it would look as if you couldn't put a bridge anywhere on the site, but because the floodway is really the key, the hydraulic pressure isn't so great in the areas on the edges. It's in this zone that's the most important for the span.
So we're going to share with you three different proposals, and they're very different. They're intentionally different because we wanted to elicit your feedback and your thoughts on the pros and cons of each. In addition to that, we could also imagine that some of the schemes, different aspects of the schemes can be hybridized. But at this early stage, it's helpful that they actually take on very different forms so that we can understand what you find valuable about each form and then try to factor it into a more comprehensive scheme. In each of the proposals, we'll share with you the location of the proposal as well as a fly-through, which is just to show you the form, and then we'll conclude with some initial renderings of what the material palettes for the projects might be. These are nicknames that we gave each so that we could identify what was kind of the asset of each of these projects.
So the Assabet River landing is based on the idea that one might create not just a connection, but a place to be, a place to spend time, a broader, more plaza-like condition. That's a destination unto itself, in addition to being
you might recognize the High Line as a piece of infrastructure that also carries with it a lot of public space and opportunity for community gathering at different scales. And again, the idea of narrowing and compression and expansion does allow people to both move across a bridge, but also to get off the path and eat lunch, look, gather.
So these first two schemes, including this one, the Assabet Landing, we're showing using these northern connections. So this straight shot across from Baker Ave and the connection across the Neshoba Brook or along the edge of it from the north end of the Bruce Freeman Trail. We're looking at that shortest possible crossing of the floodway, and there's a couple of different orientations that could take. Straight in line with this axis, or at an angle to make it even a little shorter, or what we came up with for this scheme was a kinked path that would create shorter spans relative to the floodway, but also connect to the general directionality of the paths. So it would kind of follow the course of the paths that these two entrance points would describe.
So in this scheme, when we realized that there was some interesting negotiation of the lines of movement, we recognized that we could create a path of movement that would, again, do the work of the bridge, but that there might actually result also some additional kinds of spaces that might be these spaces, maybe a fisherman, maybe you could have lunch along that edge, things like that would get you off the trail, off the actual line of movement. So we were trying with this, we call it the landing because we thought it could act as a destination for the community as well.
So this is that critical cross-section, the red line being the height below which we cannot place any structure in the floodway. We can have some supports, but the primary spanning structure has to stay above that line. So in this scheme, because it's more of a beam bridge design where most of the structure is beneath the footpath, that has to be a little bit higher. So the footpath has to rise up a little bit. So the structure can be beneath it, but still above that line. And that creates this opportunity for ramps at the end. So it's a more gradual connection. Everything would be ADA accessible, but it does have to have some ramps. Any of these schemes have to have some ramping to get up high enough. But that's the kind of figure that results.
And we don't mean for the bridge to appear white. It's not going to be a white bridge. Again, this is just a sort of test maquette model.
Yeah, this is just it's not a material study, it's just a three-dimensional study to see how it would look on the site.
Yeah, just to see its shape.
So you can see the ramps leading up and connecting to the paths. This one shooting off to meet this part of the site, and these broad overhangs on either side of the path that allow for some observation of the waterway, gathering, fishing. And it's a little washed out, but this is following someone's path across the bridge.
So in situation that you would rise up gently on an ADA slope and reach this, and in every scheme there's a little bit of a crown at the top of at the midpoint. But what it would allow is that, and as James said, because we have to lift up above that important red line, it might allow the termination of each of the bridges to offer some kind of public space and or gathering opportunity, a place to sit. And in this view, you can begin to see, again, it's very early on, but we were envisioning the warmth of wood as a material, as a deck that would be kind of a liner inside of this concrete structure. And it would hopefully make an area that's pleasant to sit and enjoy this riparian landscape.
Ultimately, this is all about the structure underneath, an open path with nothing higher than guardrails on the sides, so it's essentially very open to the sky and to the landscape.
And then at night, we thought that it would be a beautiful thing to have a light twinkle in the landscape that would be carefully controlled so that it would light the areas of gathering, but be very sensitive to not overlighting through light pollution of the riparian landscape below.
So the second scheme is in generally the same location, but a completely different structural strategy. So this is based on the idea of an enclosure. So by developing some height, we can gain structural depth so the structure is not underneath the walkway, but essentially above the walkway.
This strategy belongs to what I would think of as trellises and part of the landscape picturesque. This happens to be an illustration from the 18th century in India, but we thought that it becomes a kind of armature, if you will, for vegetation, and also is in the tradition of covered bridges, which you find all over the New England area, in which the structure, again, the truss structure is above, but is often covered to varying degrees. You will see a lot of these covered bridges have a great deal of ability to look out, but some of them are quite enclosed. But the idea there was that in this case, we can lift the structure up in the truss, and it was very exciting for us to think about how one would make a lattice, a trellis, through which one could enjoy the landscape as well.
So again, using these two path connections that we described, and one obvious one is to go straight across, but the shortest route's actually at more perpendicular to the waterway and connects to some existing path junctures on the other side. And with slight modification, can include a overlook into the wetland area on this side.
Yeah. And at this, and at this end could offer a kind of room, if you will, or a space at the end, which would allow for an expansive view into the forest.
So again, here's the cross-section that we have to contend with. But because the structure is mostly above the walkway instead of below it, we can be a little lower, and the ramps don't have to be as long. So there's shorter ramps and steps at the ends to connect it to the surrounding landscape. Again, this is a material-free fly-through without character, but just showing the shape in the landscape. And it has a couple of offshoots where you can step outside of the structure and look out towards the water. So it's not all contained within the volume of the truss.
And we were just again, very early on, we were just at the beginning of exploring how that skin system and that lattice might work, where it would open up, where it would become more transparent, where it would be more about protecting the structure.
So looking from the West Concord side, looking back in this direction, you can see we're in the building back here, that this could be situated in a way that was more building-like, because you can see structure above the walkway, but could also tie into these existing paths and create a more sheltered experience of crossing the river, but still open enough to have views and have some larger openings which completely, open up to the site.
The last scheme, we called this the crossing scheme. It's actually situated in parallel with the commuter rail. And we call this the crossing scheme partly because this is an opportunity for paths to literally unite in a confluence and come together. And we were looking at, again, here's the commuter rail.
And that's that narrow neck, the narrowest neck of the floodway that we described. This part of the site is also possible to integrate a true bike trail, whereas any bikes crossing the site up here would have to be walked. It's not possible to really make a bike trail through the forest and through that conservation area on the West Concord side. So this side could potentially be a true bike trail. So those are the longer spans for the two bridges we showed before, and this shorter span. Though at this end, because of the terrain, we need more extended pathways that are raised above ground. So the spans wouldn't be as wide, but there would be more of them. But it could connect as a true bike trail.
There are many communities that are doing either a complete rails to trails conversion and or saddlebag trails adjacent to rails because the easements and right-of-ways are there. So should that happen as a part of a larger system, this kind of project could infrastructurally begin to connect to other trail systems. And here they come together, they kiss, and then they fork.
So this is bike trail and this is walking path, and they join and use the same bridge, but they have discrete areas so people feel safe walking next to someone who's biking.
We also recognize that the commuter rail can, there's noise and might be some concern about the feeling of going against a kind of train, a moving train. So what we thought about, which was interesting to us, is to kind of place a veil, a slat system, a kind of a lattice, if you will, against that edge, so that the project is a little bit asymmetrical in its cross-section, because it registers, this is the beginnings of an idea of a veil, which would allow views through, but would just gently shield one from the presence of the rail too, although you would still be able to see the rail, especially for those who enjoy trains. Again, a fly-through with no material indications here, just to looking at the form and the shape and the geometry. this was the idea of that lattice that might shield one's exposure to the commuter.
But it changes as you move around it, so you could have views in some orientations and not in others. And it's low enough that passing trains could still see, riders on the train could still see across it out to the landscape. But they would be, aware of its presence as another route through the site.
And then here you can see the beginnings of the place where the two paths unite before they split off. And from the commuter rail, if you were on the train, you would see still that view, but this would be the pedestrian bridge in front of that view. And then at night, we were quite interested in the quality of this kind of jack-o'-lantern effect, that you would have this glowing thing there that, again, we hope that in all of the schemes, the community would author the things that would happen on these bridges, because I think that they could be actually quite festive at different times of year for seasonal festivities and seasonal events. So, yeah, please.
So we've been asked to give everyone the microphone because it's being recorded. Well,
it's not for sound, unfortunately, it's just for recording.
They want to record comments and get feedback, yeah.
Designs have pluses and minuses. One of my thoughts is we get a lot of snow here.
Mm-hmm.
How would snow removal be conducted with each of these three designs?
The covered bridge is obviously covered partly. What we were thinking about in that trellis, in the trellis strategy, was that the slats would become much tighter at the top. So it forms a kind of roof condition. That could also occur depending on how solid the roof is over the crossing proposal, the third one as well, because that was partially enclosed. So that would be one way to deal with it. Obviously, when it is open, like the first scheme that we showed, the landing scheme, snow removal has to take place, and that is a maintenance issue for West Concord to take on, for sure.
I mean, physically, though, can what drives down their sidewalks be able to go through there? And
Yeah.
so where would they push the snow?
Yeah. So in all the bridges that we've designed, they have, each one of them has had to be both ADA accessible as well as be able to take the loads, the dead load of an ambulance and other kinds of vehicles, partly just for safety reason if something were to happen on the bridge. This goes for all the bridges that we've designed. So the minimum width that we've worked with, for example, on the Marsupial Bridge, which is the bridge in Wisconsin, that was 10 feet because that was a good clearance for vehicles and for both maintenance vehicles if necessary, and or if there was an emergency, that a vehicle could get up to that location. So that is something that for every bridge project, one needs to have that kind of access. That's an excellent question.
Generally, the smaller vehicles that help to clear sidewalks should fit on these bridges. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
I like the idea of public events and public space being built into any of the designs of the bridge, especially in a town like Concord. That's, I think, something that might happen more than in other communities. I remember in 2002 when Elizabeth Warren kicked off her campaign, she made her Concord appearance with I guess, the state senators and representatives walking over the bridge over Neshoba Brook, right behind Neshoba Bakery. And there was the press and maybe security and Elizabeth Warren and Corey Atkins and I think Senator Mike Barrett. But it was a very public event over water. The setting behind Neshoba Bakery, the buildings were kind of, funky, I guess. But that's Neshoba Bakery. But anyway, incorporating public space celebrations or what have you, sounds like a very appealing idea.
Could I ask what kind of events, aside from, say, a political rally, what other kinds of events could you imagine wanting to participate in, or being, even if it's an individual hanging out thing? But
river festivals, we have solstice festivals, we have
yeah.
we have farmers market, we have all kinds of things that go on all year round in Concord.
Yeah.
Would you find it interesting to be able to locate some of those things and or tie it in
Expand
with
them into that kind of space? Yeah.
So in terms of types of events, just this past weekend I participated in this River Fest that was actually held down at the Old North Bridge this year, and participated in a cardboard boat race. Okay, and it was a slapdash crazy event. I don't know if actually the Old North Bridge was the ideal location. I mean, certainly it gave opportunity for people to view and so on. But it also kind of conflicted with the tourists that came there primarily for their historical interest. We had, a reenactor standing there in British regalia having to sort of, deal with all of these people. So actually, I think that for an event like that, this kind of setting would be potentially a better setting. And that kind of event that, attracts people that we already have going on in town, and that, having sort of spectator capability would be fantastic.
Right, right.
I also wonder if there's a way we could almost make the bridge, is this on?
It is. It doesn't broadcast, but it's just recording. Yeah.
If there's a way that we could make the bridge almost like an occasional art gallery where we hang art, we have an active artist community so
that's a great idea.
Is that something that you've done, that you've seen
actually,
done?
So the Marsupial Bridge, I keep referencing that because that happens to have incredible community authorship in that project. It has been the site of pop-up art, music, film festival, really unusual video art installation. It has, from the structure above, there has been different kinds of performance art occurring. There are films. In fact, a theater performance also occurred there, as well as a dance in which the dancers were dancing with the bridge. So it actually exceeded our expectations in terms of what could be produced there. But because it was inviting enough, and this was a space that was essentially a no man's land, it was under an existing viaduct. It felt dangerous, quite frankly. It was, but it's now. I'm very happy and proud of the fact that it ends up on album covers for musicians and weddings and things like that, because people have just found it to be an important part of the community, the identity of the place. So I think that I welcome that.
Just to follow up, I'm sorry. I wasn't here, I came in late, but what's the space on either side of the bridge? What's the landing space? Is there an open space where people could gather?
It depends on the scheme and the location, but in one scheme, so there's did you see the site next to the commuter rail? That is a little bit harder to create kind of a landing space. It's more linear. But in the site that's out here in the middle of the site, it's one of the schemes we're calling the landing scheme, has a kind of amphitheater-like end. One end, there's a ramp that leads down from the primary path, and then an
and
amphitheater.
That could be combined also with the trellis scheme.
We could combine different strategies.
If that was something that was, again, we didn't show that in all the schemes because we were intentionally trying to create more difference, but certainly if that was something, like, we always believe that the entrances to the bridges themselves are just as important as the crossing. So it would be an opportunity to create a kind of pause in the system to encourage that kind of movement and that kind of event.
Hi. I have a question about, I think I'm thinking about today, how the sites are. So for example, if you were going to come from the train with a bicycle and you wanted to ride over to this site. I think it would be pretty easy from the train now to get onto the bridge that's near it, the future bridge
Yes.
nearest the
Parallel
train.
to it, yeah.
But like, where do you land? Same with the trail along the river is really kind of a mess today. I don't know if the town would, it's kind of overgrown. It's not good for a bike. It's just, so I don't know if the town's willing to invest money to like make the connections on either side of the bridge make sense.
So I think my understanding is that on the West Concord side, around the elderly housing, that's actually private land that will be granted a right-of-way to reach a new bridge. So I don't know what the arrangement is in terms of upkeep and maintenance of the path per se. I don't know.
Yeah, and well, there are plans to extend, on the other end where the bridge intersects with the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, where it's currently just a single narrow path, that's going to be expanded so that it will be at least consistent all the way around. Now, that still is less than, let's say, the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail with a paved surface and all of that. So it would have a different character. Yeah, well, the thing is that you would not be able to ride a bike is the current thought. You'd have to walk your bike. Yeah. So I think that is a consideration when you think of the utility of the bridge for the people here.
So just to reiterate, the first two sites, the first two schemes that we showed with the site out here, kind of more in the middle of the forest, that's not strictly speaking a bike trail. It's a walking path that one could bring your bike.
You can walk your bike.
You could walk your bike through, but it wouldn't be a bike trail.
Thank you. I have questions about the land use. Since the land around Concord Park is privately owned, is it known whether there will be changes to that land within the foreseeable future? Right now we're looking at great big open spaces, and what if that changes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is currently a project to extend Concord Park in the direction of the Neshoba Brook. So that wing of the building is to be extended. I don't know if the ZBA has granted its final approval or whatever, but the planning board, we reviewed that. And yet the rest of the site will be maintained as a conservation type of site. So I don't think that you'll see changes in the area anywhere near the river. And I don't anticipate much more expansion of the buildings.
One thing that's interesting. Oh,
Matt, you were referring to this section.
That's right. So the building there that you see outlined.
Sorry, I'll let you point.
Yeah. So this building here is being extended a bit, and then the parking lot is going to be extended a little bit as well to accommodate the additional parking requirements. But then this is remaining the same, except for this trail is going to be constructed to be similar to the condition that this part of the trail is in.
I will say that your question is so important because not knowing the deep history of the sites and the various ownership, just trying to walk the area as an ignorant person was very helpful, I think, because what I was feeling as I walked the site, of course, behind the assisted living, it does feel quite privatized, and so when we were toying around with exactly the orientation of the bridge itself, it was not only to find the best strategic opportunity structurally to shorten the span, but also so that we could orient towards the natural direction of the path as opposed to poking the view like right towards the assisted living. We weren't sure, especially now that this is going to be extended as well. So we were trying to be sensitive to how you would get to the other side and what you would be seeing as you get off the bridge or as you get on the bridge. So those are very important and interesting questions for sure.
There's 1, 2, and 3.
Hi, so I'm really torn between the first and third plans. The landing plan certainly is far better for pedestrians, for social use of the area, for enjoyment of the wetland, for gathering spaces, for so many reasons. And I love the openness of the bridge. I mean, the trellis design seems nice for the small number of people that it would accommodate as an outdoor room. But it's uninviting to the people who aren't actually currently in the trellis. They seem shut out, like they should let those other people stay there and they shouldn't go. So I'm less fond of that plan. The bridge that's closest to the commuter trail is clearly better for bicycle traffic. There's currently the commuter rail is currently an attractive nuisance for people who sometimes incredibly dangerously walk down it because there's no faster way to get between. And people who had to walk their bike might continue, well, they probably wouldn't walk their bikes. At any rate, it's clearly better for bicycle traffic, and it would also be better for use of the Baker Ave extension area as overflow parking for the rail trail, either free or the businesses could make some money by charging for it. But I also recall that back when I was on the West Concord Task Force, the MBTA pretty much said, over our dead body, would we allow anything close enough to the railroad bridge that under any possible circumstance, the tiniest pebble could be kicked up by any train and come within 300 yards of the other side of the universe. So it might require a solid wall or a very fine fence. I think overall I prefer the landing plan just because of the tremendous value to the town of the gathering space and the beauty of the bridge, the ability for people to enjoy the crossing, drop their poo sticks and watch them on the other side. But I admit it's tricky navigating these two questions. So thanks.
Thank you. You've identified the conflict that we've talked about in the first round as well. But there's that trade-off between those two locations and the two strategies. Yeah.
You writing the check?
Hi, I've got a comment and a question. When you started the presentation, Matt said that the main purpose was to connect the business community with the village. And you've got a whole other population over at the large condominium complex right over there that we just happen to live at. So you've got...
Are you referring to that?
No. Yeah. No. I mean Concord Green.
Oh,
that
yes,
direction.
yes, of course.
Yes.
Oh, right here. Right here. With the water feature that runs through.
Right.
Yes.
So
the water feature,
you've got a large community over there that would benefit from this, and I think you've got a lot of support for it. And these people vote. Okay.
No, thank you for mentioning that.
So ideally, from among the different sites, what appeals most to your...
Well, I can't speak for everybody, but I do think that transportation would be their main purpose in the bridge. So having something more southerly would be good too, because it's closer to where we would cross Baker Ave to come to the opening to the bridge, right?
If you were to walk currently, you'd walk across this Main Street bridge across
and we walk
Assabet.
across the Assabet on that little narrow bridge.
Yeah, with tiny little walkways.
Exactly. So. So this
Isn't there
would be
some plan currently for a renovation of that?
Yeah, we've been told that not in our lifetime.
Well, that came up. Just the quality of that other.
Someone raised an interesting question earlier.
Yeah.
Because it's dangerous and it's very narrow.
It is. It is. So this would be a way for us to get over to the village without having to go over that little bridge. So this would be great.
So if you, just so I understand, if you used a bridge in this area, you'd cross the railroad tracks at grade here.
We'd cross it at Baker Ave.
At Baker Ave.
Exactly.
Right over here.
Exactly.
It's right there, yeah. And then come across.
Right, so we have to cross Baker Ave, but we don't have to cross the Assabet on Main Street.
Right.
Okay? Yeah. So it's a big win for us. And it's a large community, so you could get some support there. My question is there a big cost differential between these designs? Your cost estimate was a wide range.
Yeah, it's
So we, in the feasibility study, just to be clear, we were not asked to do that feasibility study. That was actually hired by the town for engineers to take on before that. They came up with a cost estimate between 2.6 and 3.2.
2 million to 3.6 million. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a wide. It was a
what
wide.
they had envisioned.
It was a,
I think a project like this, again, from our experience, would be a public-private partnership.
Okay.
One interesting thing is that in the CMAQ grant process, it is very advantageous to be able to, because the CMAQ is Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Grant. So if you are able to prove that you're actually encouraging bike and or other alternative forms
pedestrian,
of congestion mitigation, then you do bump up a little higher in the point system for that. That's an aside. But what's interesting though is that in that CMAQ process, it would be very beneficial. I mean, it's harder to argue for congestion mitigation if you're not allowing it to be a bike-friendly bridge. If it's a bike-friendly bridge, then also it does need to adhere to AASHTO guidelines, which are bicycle standards. So railings get a little higher. I mean, there are impacts to it. But in terms of questions of cost, this, for the bridge portion, this is the shortest span, but it does have extensions. The public-private partnership that, I mean, when we spoke, actually in the previous meeting at 4:30, the building owner of this building talked about the kinds of improvements that they would like to see on their property, and of course this bridge would benefit them as well. So I think that it would be really wonderful if this community tried to investigate where those public and private partnerships could come together, because anyway the CMAQ, even if you get a large portion through something like the CMAQ grant, there will be requirement that the town matches. There's some matching fund,
the private
a portion of
funding
it.
can help leverage the public funding often.
you have skin in the game, and then
Yeah,
give
Yes,
exactly.
yes, exactly.
So to Sue's point of, I also like both the landing and the crossing. Is there some way to add some landing areas to the crossing design, like
Definitely.
where it forks, where you
Definitely.
have that fork of the bike versus?
Yeah, for sure.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yes, so
Yeah,
we
yeah,
could
sure.
combine those two ideas
Yeah,
a little
we
bit
could
in the crossing
combine-
design?
We could combine qualities of the landing project with this. We probably can't combine the bike trail with the landing project.
Exactly.
We can't really get the bike trail to it. But in terms of some cross-fertilization, we
viewing
imagined
space.
that this was just a starting point with ideas and that we'd be recombining ideas. So that would be very possible, yeah.
I had a similar question, and that has already been partially answered. I would like to, I work up on the third floor of this building. I live on Coburn Hill Road, and I have a lovely 5-minute commute that I must make by car because I cannot safely cross Route 2 on foot or on a bike. But I would like to speak on behalf of some of my coworkers who live in town and couldn't attend tonight. We have a number of employees who live and work in West Concord, and they would benefit tremendously from having the most efficient way of getting over that river to work. And we have a number of employees who take the commuter rail from the city to get out of here, or to get out here to their jobs. And they would also benefit tremendously from the most efficient way, which I have to say from this looks to be the crossing. I too was thinking of adding landing capabilities to the crossing, but for a slightly different reason. If I were someone in middle school or high school, my goodness, that landing would look like a really great unsupervised place to go, well out of the public eye, to do things that used to be done on the railroad tracks before the bike path was built. And for that reason, I think that making this bridge maybe a little bit more visible is perhaps in the community's interest, including that of those young people.
There is a possibility for what they call passive policing. So in terms of visibility, if a public space is visible, it tends to feel more safe. Whether that's literally true or not, it's a real perception that people have, and I think it makes people feel more comfortable in a public space that has some visibility from or to places that are other places that are occupied, whether they're buildings or roads or whatnot. You know.
Yeah, so
there's
when people feel observed, they tend to moderate their behavior.
And so the other thing that we've noticed is that if the infrastructure is designed really with a civic component, an engagement in public art and other things, I think the general tendency is that it's just more used. The more the bridge gets used, the better and safer it will be. And that is the most, so that means that we really should pay attention to qualities of the lighting and the way that, that you carefully control the facial recognition. Like light has to be in a very specific way so that you can see somebody who's coming towards you so you feel safe. And so I think there are many aspects like that I think on a sensitive site as this is, I think it would really benefit from a high quality of design intervention where these things are considered, because again, I think if it becomes attractive and useful, at the same time people will use it, it will be safer. In our experience on bridge projects, it's highway bridges and other bridges that don't really get this kind of care and attention that result in unsafe spaces. So we have an experience in one project where they actually, the community much later, 15 years later, took out the lighting that we originally designed, and all of a sudden gangs are coming there. So we are very aware of, just the smallest thing. I mean, it has to be beautifully lit, it has to be inviting, it has to be a space that the community is proud of, that they identify, we hope that it would be, among your other beautiful bridges, part of the span of history of your beautiful bridges. I think it could take on that character, and I think it would benefit.
I think that's also consistent with one of the points that was raised in the most recent town survey. Our town does a survey on a regular basis about concerns of the people who live here. And one of the top concerns in this year has been the character of the community and maintaining this as a positive, inviting, communally oriented place to live. So I think that's all consistent.
Right. One thing that's interesting about your community that I learned in getting to know Marcia and Elizabeth and Matt is that you don't have a business district in the sense that like a TIF district, tax increment. So it's an interesting thing because I think that as communities go, this is a more difficult community to enact significant, let's say, design changes, for example, to the landscaping of your streets. It's harder to enact those kinds of improvements when you don't have a TIF district. So again, a lot of the other kinds of infrastructure projects we've engaged have really benefited from that particular economic political structure to invest in aspects of their towns that really enhance the community identity, I think, that you're referring to. So I hear you very much on that. And I think that there are aspects of the West Concord downtown area that are really wonderful and can be continually honed. So,
and one thing that is particularly nice about West Concord as a village is how active it is during all times of the week, all 7 days of the week. I think that is something that speaks more in favor of the crossing. The crossing would probably get more visibility during those 7 days of the week, whereas the landing would obtain visibility primarily during the 5 work days of the week. This building that we're in is largely empty on the weekends.
And we understand there's about 1,000+ employees here in this building alone. Is that right? Somebody had mentioned that to us.
That sounds right.
Is there another question? Oh, yeah.
It's true this building is mostly empty on weekends, but there is a hotel now and there may be further expansion. I also just want to make sure it gets said out loud that the benefit is not just to connect the people here to West Concord for the sake of business, but also to improve the West Concord's economic viability with people going to shop there, to eat lunch, to get ice cream, and so forth. Until your comment, I was about to suggest saying we should build the crossing and then take the landing plan and build it on the landing site separately, just as a sort of a mini public amphitheater, although you make an interesting point about supervision in a less visible area. But regardless of that, I want to point out one other thing, which is that the MBTA is currently doing a gigantic planning initiative to overhaul the commuter rail. It is not clear yet what they'll do. The worst case scenario is that they will increase the current heavy diesel trains to 1 per half hour, which means
Could you speak up a little bit because some people couldn't
Okay,
hear.
let me try to speak up a little bit more. The MBTA is doing a huge... Okay. The MBTA is working up a huge planning initiative for the commuter rail. It'll be a giant overhaul to last for a generation or two. The worst case scenario is that they will increase the current heavy diesel trains to 1 per half hour, and since they're going in both directions, that's at least 1.5, if not 2 per hour. And the best case scenario is that they would have trains going every 15 minutes, but they would be electrical multiple units. They would be far less polluting and much quieter, but not quiet. So if we have the crossing plan, it would be difficult to have good outdoor programming or pleasant picnicking next to so many trains, either a larger number of very noisy, polluting trains or a much larger number of quieter but still noisy trains. And I think that that is a serious consideration for the viability of the crossing plan for outdoor programming. I don't mean to say that that makes it a bad plan, just that we should keep that in mind. It's still the best plan for connecting by bicycle and for Concord Green, assuming the state never bothers to fix the Assabet River crossing over Main Street. But it probably isn't a great place to get a lot of really good public picnicking and gathering. And by the way, everybody write to the state and say, you want the full electrification plan for our commuter rail. My God, we need this. We would save so much money in healthcare costs from pollution. I'm getting off topic. Matt?
I was actually only half joking when I said let's build all three. And what I mean by that is that I actually love the trellis design. I think it's gorgeous. And it reminds me of the Arguinzuela footbridge in Madrid, where I was fortunate to live there at the time that was built, and I've been across it, and it's fantastic. It's like an experience to just go across it. But I also would like that trellis design to be at, or similar design to be at this site close to the railroad tracks and to have both bicycle and pedestrian access as the Arguinzuela Bridge does. The other thing is I love having a landing, a place to hang out, but it doesn't have to be on the bridge itself. You could build the landing down there, just at on the shoreline. You could have a nice hangout spot somewhere else.
Actually, if we manipulated the section so that the new bridge would be adjacent to and kind of shielding from the rail line and get down a little bit beneath and behind that, you'd almost never see the trains. You would still have some sound, but you would feel like you were in a different place just by changing elevation a little bit.
But, we could have a structure, a gazebo, something, down there, down the path.
Yeah.
And so, because we're trying to mix all these different potential uses, there's this serious commuter need. There's also a desire to hang out and to recreate. And I think that, you don't have to pile it all on in one spot. And then I'd love to have world-class design. That would be fantastic.
So I think one of the things, as we walked this portion of the site, currently the assisted living, this would have to be essentially, with the bridge in this location, would have to be landscaped properly. And, right now that's the location of the dumpsters and whatnot for the assisted living. So there's definitely work to be done there, but it's absolutely doable. It's nothing that is outrageous in terms of expectation or difficulty. and methods of shielding that kind of, it's
But
kind of their loading area.
It does feel, in many cases, like this is the best possible route to many destinations, including this area, and including this area, and further afield, but you get more possibilities for all that different traffic.
Well, the other
High and
pitch
low
I'd
speeds.
like to make is that we have a long-term dream, and it was a big point in the long-range plan, that there is currently not a great bicycle route between the two Concord Center and West Concord Village. And you've got to get across the river at some point. We're probably not going to get the funds to build a second bridge for that route. So this one, hopefully, is the start of something that could eventually grow into a bicycle route that goes all the way to the Concord Center.
Yeah.
And so, I think we shouldn't just think of it in terms of, hey, how do we get to Baker Ave, but how do we go all the way eventually? Think big.
Yeah. I'm just gonna.
Other questions, comments? This is so helpful to us.
I just had a follow-on question, which was if we were to take this idea of using the crossing, but providing a sort of a landing a little bit further north, I wonder if the bridge at the crossing could provide a bit of a sound barrier?
Yes.
Especially if it has to be more solid on the MBTA side to keep the MBTA happy. I'd be sorry not to see the trains, but I could live without that. I see them elsewhere.
Yeah, so if you could get down below here, you'd have this kind of shield of the new bridge between you and the existing rail line. If one wanted to, one could feel remote. But I was also just going to quickly go forward to a drawing that refers to what you just mentioned, Matt. Sorry, I'm just going to go here. This is it's a rough GIS plan, but this is Concord, West Concord, and that right there is the bike trail along Elm Street, which I guess is the old route. Is that Route 2 or Turnpike? Elm Street.
Elm Street, yeah.
And connecting across through Baker Ave, through this site, could find its way up to that to create a more direct route between. We could be thinking that way about that larger connectivity.
It was graphically challenging to see this, but all these little red bits are trails that are disconnected actually from each other. So I thought it is interesting for you to see your region with, some trail systems, but that don't actually, they're kind of isolated within neighborhoods or communities, but not actually connected. So as a long-term goal, I think, this drawing was very interesting to us because all those red zones need to somehow get knitted together.
Is there a route that's possible that we're not seeing yet?
Yeah, they look like little squiggles. That's exactly right.
I was just saying that, there's more than meets the eye here, that this trail actually continues through over into here. It does stop, unfortunately, before you, and some of the property rights issues are pretty serious there. So some of the right-of-way may not no longer exist, but there are streets that then go into Elm Street. And so, this is a beautiful
That would be ideal.
yeah. And like I say, today, at least it de facto goes all the way here. This is conservation land with trails. So there's something there.
Well, that would be the most attractive, wouldn't it?
Oh.
To go
Well,
around the
it's
waterways.
longer, but
and
we're
find
not talking about, 50 miles here. This is. There's farm fields. Oh. Okay, no, you can go to here. This is as far as you can get. But even to here, then there's, I think it's Nimrod or something is the street that goes right to here. So, right. And so there's a serious right-of-way issue that would have to be worked out to get there. But I'm just saying, there's a dream anyway, if not a hope.
Would you happen to know where the Reformatory Trail comes in?
Well, so this is the old Reformatory branch line, of the rail. This was the rail line. The rail line did go right through here and all the way to the Reformatory. So once upon a time, but now since then, Route 2 has blown through that. Some of the land has been, I don't know, given away or sold off or something, and it's no longer. And well, there's more than one missing bridge. It used to actually it crossed here and here. Yeah, so there were two bridges. But I think a bike wouldn't have to cross twice. A train had no choice but to, because it couldn't turn that sharply.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Well, I want to be sensitive to everyone's time.
We have mics, so
I just wanted to mention that there are these 8.5 by 11 sheets. Actually, there's one of them on both sides. The schemes, the different proposals are on one side, and then just a map to locate on the other. And we would love your feedback. What we plan to do is to, if you follow us on Instagram, it's La Dahlman Architects. Also, if you're interested in commenting, but we love the analog, handwritten comments, and we're taking a lot from the meeting today and from the 4:30. But it would be wonderful to get these comments.
It's actually really important for you to share your thoughts with us, but also to write them down. If you have strong inclinations, preferences, important issues of connectivity, please record it so that it becomes part of the record. And yeah.
Just to follow up, one more thought on the Reformatory Trail, and that is that it originates in Bedford. And the town of Bedford is committed $6 million to extending and making the trail more than just an artifact, making it, modernizing it, and bringing it to the Concord border.
Oh,
so
wow.
it's really on us now to carry the ball from there.
Can you educate me? The Reformatory is north of the penitentiary. It is the prison,
Yeah.
or it was the property across the street? Okay.
Yeah, we know.
Yeah, I'm talking about the bike trail.
Okay, because I thought there was another property
There's
across
a trail
the
that
road
originates in Bedford and ends
that's
up
Prison
at the prison.
Farm. Okay.
And it actually exists.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's kind of connected.
Okay.
We're
I've never
available
been
to
on it.
talk
I don't know.
about the drawings and models and whatnot too. Just to
Thank you very much.
know about it.
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your feedback.
Yeah, thank you for your feedback. I'm great.